A carpenter's son stands before the temple in Jerusalem, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift whip of cords. Merchants scatter, tables overturn, coins clatter across stone floors. Gold and silver roll into corners as doves flutter free from toppled cages. You have turned my father's house into a den of thieves. The year is approximately 30 AD, and this man, known to his followers as Yeshua of Nazareth, has just committed what authorities would consider an act of vandalism, possibly even insurrection. Yet 2,000 years later, the very institution claiming to follow his teachings owns more wealth than most nations. The Vatican Bank manages assets worth approximately 5.6 billion euros. The Church of England's investment portfolio exceeds 10 billion pounds. The Mormon Church's stock portfolio alone surpasses $100 billion. Televangelists own private jets worth $65 million each, while medieval cathedrals built with the coins of peasants now charge admission fees to tourists. The carpenter who told a rich young ruler to sell everything and give to the poor might find this peculiar. Let me paint you a scene from 325 AD, nearly 3 centuries after that temple incident. Emperor Constantine sits in a palace in Nicaea, surrounded not by fishermen and tax collectors, but by bishops dressed in fine robes. They're not discussing how to feed the hungry or shelter the homeless. They're debating the precise nature of divinity, crafting creeds, establishing hierarchies. The Roman Empire that once crucified their founder now sponsors their councils. The persecuted have become the establishment. The revolution has been institutionalized. But here's where it gets interesting. In those early days after the crucifixion, followers of the Way, they didn't even call themselves Christians yet, shared everything in common. The book of Acts describes them selling their possessions and distributing the proceeds according to each person's need. No one claimed private ownership. They met in homes, broke bread together, and their leaders were chosen from among themselves. Peter, their supposed first pope, was a fisherman who denied even knowing Jesus 3 times when the pressure mounted. Paul, their greatest evangelist, made tents to support himself rather than burden the communities he served. Fast forward to 1095. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd in Clermont, France. He's not preaching about turning the other cheek or loving your enemies. He's calling for a holy war. God wills it, the crowd roars back. The First Crusade begins, and over the next 2 centuries, millions will die in wars fought in the name of the Prince of Peace. Knights wearing crosses on their armor will massacre Muslims, Jews, and even other Christians in Constantinople. The man who said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," might have some questions about this interpretation of his message. Speaking of interpretations, let's talk about a document that changed everything. The donation of Constantine, supposedly written by Emperor Constantine himself, granted the Pope dominion over Rome, Italy, and the entire Western Roman Empire. For centuries, this document justified papal authority over kings and emperors. There was just one problem. It was completely fake. Forged sometime in the 8th century, it wasn't definitively exposed as fraudulent until the 15th century. By then, the Church had accumulated vast estates, commanded armies, and crowned emperors based partly on a lie. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into history's most fascinating contradictions. If you're finding value in this exploration, consider hitting that super thanks button. It helps us keep uncovering these incredible stories. Quick question for you. What time is it where you're watching this? Drop it in the comments below. I'm always amazed by our global audience tuning in from every corner of the world. Now, consider this figure. $1.2 billion. That's how much the Catholic Church in America alone spent between 2004 and 2012 on settlements related to abuse scandals. Not on feeding the hungry, not on housing the homeless. On legal settlements and therapy for victims of predator priests who were systematically protected and moved from parish to parish by church leadership. The same institution that claims moral authority over human sexuality covered up crimes against thousands of children. Documents revealed that officials knew, documented, and consciously chose to protect the institution over the innocent. But corruption isn't just a Catholic problem. In 1987, televangelist Jim Bakker's PTL ministry collapsed amid fraud charges and sex scandals, having bilked followers out of $158 million. Oral Roberts told his television audience that God would call him home if they didn't send $8 million by a deadline. He got the money. Creflo Dollar asked his congregation to fund a $65 million Gulfstream G650 jet because his current jet was getting old. Kenneth Copeland, who owns multiple jets, refused to fly commercial because he didn't want to sit in a tube filled with demons, his term for regular passengers. The prosperity gospel now dominates many megachurches, teaching that God wants you to be rich, that poverty is a sign of weak faith, that sending money to preachers will unlock heavenly rewards. Joel Osteen's net worth exceeds $50 million. His church, which receives $600,000 in weekly donations, initially refused to open its doors to Hurricane Harvey victims until public pressure forced their hand. The man who said, "Foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head," might find this theology creative. Let's step back to 1517. A German monk named Martin Luther nails his 95 Theses to a church door in Wittenberg. His primary complaint? The sale of indulgences, literally selling forgiveness of sins to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. The church was running a pay-to-play salvation scheme. Rich nobles could buy their way out of purgatory while peasants suffered. Johann Tetzel, the indulgence salesman, had a catchy jingle. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. The carpenter who overturned the money changers' tables might recognize this scene. The Reformation that followed split Christianity into competing factions, each claiming to represent true faith. Wars erupted across Europe. The 30 Years' War alone killed up to 8 million people, approximately 20% of the population in affected regions. Catholics killed Protestants. Protestants killed Catholics. Both killed Anabaptists, who had the audacity to suggest that maybe, just maybe, people should choose their faith rather than have it imposed by the state. Meanwhile, as Europeans fought over doctrine, they also exported their faith at sword point. Spanish conquistadors destroyed entire civilizations in the name of spreading Christianity. The Inquisition tortured and burned suspected heretics. Indigenous peoples worldwide were forced to abandon their cultures and beliefs. Residential schools run by churches systematically abused native children, attempting to kill the Indian to save the man. The last Canadian residential school closed in 1996. That's not ancient history, that's yesterday. Here's a fact that might surprise you. The word pope never appears in the Bible. Neither does cardinal, archbishop, or monsignor. The entire hierarchical structure of most major churches, with its ranks, titles, ceremonies, and chains of command, developed centuries after the crucifixion. Early Christian communities were led by elders chosen from among themselves. They met in homes, not cathedrals. They shared meals, not performed elaborate rituals. The earliest known Christian church building dates from around 233 AD, 2 centuries after Jesus' death. Let me tell you about the Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, who ruled from 1492 to 1503. He fathered at least 4 children while supposedly celibate, hosted orgies in the Vatican, and allegedly poisoned rivals. His son Cesare became the inspiration for Machiavelli's The Prince, the handbook for ruthless political power. The Banquet of Chestnuts, hosted in the Papal Palace in 1501, featured 50 courtesans who danced naked for the Pope and his guests, with prizes awarded to whoever could perform the most. This is documented in the diary of Johann Burchard, the Pope's own master of ceremonies. Or consider Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, who personally led armies into battle wearing armor over his papal robes. He commissioned Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling, not out of devotion, but as a display of power and wealth. The project cost approximately 3,000 ducats, equivalent to millions today, while common people starved outside the Vatican walls. The Black Death of the 14th century killed between 75 and 200 million people across Europe. The Church's response? Blame the Jews, leading to massacres across the continent. Encourage flagellants, people who whip themselves bloody in public to appease God's wrath. Sell more indulgences to terrified believers. Some clergy fled their posts, leaving the dying without last rites. Others demanded payment for services that were supposed to be acts of mercy. The plague exposed the church's impotence against actual suffering while revealing its eagerness to exploit fear. But perhaps nothing illustrates the disconnect between Jesus' teachings and institutional Christianity better than the church's relationship with slavery. For nearly 1,500 years, most Christian institutions either endorsed or remained silent about human bondage. Pope Nicholas I's papal bull, Dum Diversas in 1452, authorized Portugal to reduce any Saracens, pagans, and any other unbelievers to perpetual slavery. The Southern Baptist Convention in America was literally founded in 1845 to defend slavery as biblically justified. The man who said, "Whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me," might have some thoughts about treating humans as property. What profession do you have, by the way? I'm curious because regardless of what you do for a living, you probably have more in common with that carpenter from Nazareth than most church leaders do. Drop your job in the comments. Let's see how many different walks of life are watching. The Council of Trent convened between 1545 and 1563 in response to the Protestant Reformation, doubled down on church authority. It declared that Scripture and tradition held equal weight, that the Latin Vulgate was the only valid Bible translation, and that the Church alone could interpret Scripture. Regular people were discouraged, sometimes forbidden, from reading the Bible themselves. William Tyndale was strangled and burned at the stake in 1536 for the crime of translating the Bible into English. The authorities didn't want common people accessing the text directly. They might notice discrepancies between what was written and what was practiced. Consider the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica itself. Its construction costs led directly to the Protestant Reformation. The new basilica replaced an older church that had stood for over 1,000 years, torn down not because it was structurally unsound, but because it wasn't grand enough. The project took 120 years and the efforts of Renaissance Italy's greatest artists. The bronze for Bernini's massive baldachin over the altar was stolen from the Pantheon's ancient Roman portico. The message seems clear. Institutional glory matters more than historical preservation or fiscal responsibility. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, operated for 356 years. Its official records document over 150,000 prosecutions and at least 3,000 executions, though historians believe the actual numbers were higher. The accused faced torture to extract confessions. Methods included the strappado, hanging victims by their wrists tied behind their backs, and waterboarding, which they called toca. Property of the condemned was confiscated, creating a financial incentive for accusations. The Grand Inquisitors lived in palaces while their victims burned. The man who said, "Judge not, lest you be judged," might find this ironic. Modern prosperity preachers like Benny Hinn claim to perform healing miracles on stage, yet investigations have found no medically verified cases of supernatural healing at his crusades. He's asked followers to pledge monthly donations of up to $1,000 to become covenant partners. His ministry's private jet cost $36 million. When questioned about his wealth, he threatened to ask God to strike down his critics. The carpenter who healed the sick for free and told his disciples to "freely you have received, freely give," might question this business model. The Vatican's real estate portfolio includes properties worth an estimated 4 billion euros across Europe. The Church owns approximately 177 million acres of land globally, making it one of the world's largest landowners. This includes prime real estate in major cities, vast agricultural holdings, and even entire islands. The Vatican Bank has been repeatedly implicated in money laundering scandals, with its former president sentenced to nearly 9 years in prison for embezzlement and money laundering in 2018. The institution preaching poverty as virtue manages wealth that could eliminate poverty in entire nations. Here's something rarely discussed. Clerical celibacy wasn't mandatory for Catholic priests until the Second Lateran Council in 1139. For over 1,000 years, priests could marry. Peter himself had a wife. The Gospels mention Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. The celibacy requirement had less to do with spiritual purity and more to do with property rights. Married priests might leave church property to their children rather than back to the institution. The policy that has contributed to countless scandals and suffering was essentially about real estate. The Crusades weren't just about reclaiming the Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade never even reached Jerusalem. Instead, Crusaders sacked Constantinople in 1204, a Christian city, capital of the Byzantine Empire. They looted churches, destroyed religious art, and installed a Latin emperor. Priceless artifacts and relics were melted down for their gold and silver. The bronze horses of St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, looted from Constantinople's Hippodrome. The crown of thorns now housed in Notre Dame, sold by the Latin emperors to pay debts. Holy War became a shopping expedition. During World War II, the Vatican maintained diplomatic relations with Nazi Germany. Pope Pius X never publicly condemned the Holocaust while it was happening, though he knew of the mass murders. The Church helped numerous Nazi war criminals escape to South America through rat lines, escape routes organized by Catholic clergy. Croatian priest Krunoslav Draganović helped orchestrate the escape of the Ustaše leadership, responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Serbs, Jews, and Roma. The institution claiming moral authority remained diplomatically silent during history's greatest moral catastrophe. The witch trials that swept through Europe and America between the 15th and 18th centuries resulted in approximately 40,000 to 60,000 executions, with about 80% of victims being women. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486 and endorsed by Pope Innocent VIII, became the handbook for witch hunters. It detailed how to identify, prosecute, and execute witches. Most accused were poor, elderly, or socially marginal women. Their property was confiscated, creating economic incentives for accusations. The trials ended not because church leaders recognized their injustice, but because Enlightenment thinkers challenged the underlying superstitions. Mother Teresa, celebrated as a saint, ran facilities in Calcutta where the sick suffered in squalid conditions while millions in donations went unused. Former volunteers describe reusing needles without sterilization, denying painkillers because suffering brought people closer to Jesus, and baptizing dying Hindus and Muslims without consent. Yet she received medical care at expensive American hospitals when she fell ill. The woman, declared a saint by the church that celebrates wealth, operated what critics called homes for the dying, rather than medical facilities that might have actually saved lives. The Church of Scientology, recognized as a religion in some countries, requires members to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to advance through spiritual levels. Former members describe aggressive debt collection, forced disconnection from family members who leave, and imprisonment of dissenting members. Its founder, L. Ron Hubbard, famously said, "You don't get rich writing science fiction. If you want to get rich, you start a religion." The organization owns billions in real estate while claiming tax-exempt religious status. In 2019, an investigation revealed that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints had stockpiled over $100 billion in investments while claiming tax-exempt status as a religious organization. This fund, managed by Ensign Peak Advisors, was supposed to be for charitable purposes, but had made only 2 distributions in 22 years, both to for-profit entities owned by the church. Meanwhile, the church requires members to tithe 10% of their income, even if it means choosing between tithing and feeding their children. Young missionaries pay their own way to proselytize for 2 years, essentially providing free labor worth billions to the institution. Thanks for sticking with this deep dive into one of history's greatest contradictions. This is Professor Archive, and if this opened your eyes to some uncomfortable truths, please consider supporting the channel with a super thanks. Every bit helps us continue this work. The earliest Christians were called atheists by the Romans because they rejected the traditional gods and refused to participate in emperor worship. They met in secret, shared meals, and took care of widows and orphans. They were known for their radical love and acceptance of outcasts. slaves, women, Gentiles. The Roman historian Tacitus called them haters of humanity because they rejected the social hierarchies that kept Roman society functioning. They were dangerous not because they had armies or wealth, but because they had an idea that every human being had inherent worth, that the last would be first, that power should serve rather than dominate. That idea was revolutionary. It threatened every existing power structure. So perhaps it's not surprising that when Christianity became the state religion, it immediately began betraying its own principles. The persecuted became persecutors. The powerless sought power. The poor accumulated wealth. The servants became masters. The Geneva Bible, predating the King James Version, contained marginal notes that criticized the divine right of kings and promoted individual interpretation of Scripture. King James commissioned his new translation partly to eliminate these subversive notes. He instructed translators to use church instead of congregation and bishop instead of elder to reinforce hierarchical church structure. Even Bible translation became an exercise in maintaining institutional power rather than accurately conveying the original text. Pope Francis, despite his reformist image, oversees an institution that still protects accused predators, maintains secret archives, and refuses to fully cooperate with legal investigations. The Vatican's third highest official, Cardinal George Pell, was convicted of child sexual abuse in 2018, though the conviction was later overturned on appeal. The Church's response to abuse scandals continues to prioritize institutional protection over victim justice. Dioceses declare bankruptcy to avoid paying settlements while maintaining millions in assets transferred to other entities. Megachurch pastor John Gray received a $200,000 Lamborghini from his church's funds as an anniversary gift to his wife. Bishop Eddie Long's net worth exceeded $5 million when he died, despite multiple settlements for sexual misconduct with young male congregants. Pastor Jamal Bryant's sneaker collection, featuring shoes worth thousands of dollars each, became Instagram famous while his congregants struggled with basic needs. The disconnect between leadership lifestyle and congregant sacrifice has never been more visible thanks to social media. The Magdalen Laundries in Ireland, operated by Catholic nuns until 1996, imprisoned thousands of fallen women, unwed mothers, rape victims, orphans, and the disabled. These women worked without pay in commercial laundries, generating significant profits for the church. Many were physically and psychologically abused. Their children were often sold to American families for adoption without consent. Mass graves containing hundreds of infants have been discovered at former church institutions. The last laundry closed just 28 years ago. Survivors are still fighting for recognition and compensation. Here's a pattern worth noting. Every reform movement in Christian history eventually became the very thing it opposed. The Franciscans, founded on radical poverty, accumulated vast wealth within generations. The Jesuits, created to be learned defenders of faith, became political power brokers. The Puritans, fleeing religious persecution, established theocracies that executed Quakers and suspected witches. The Protestant reformers, opposing papal authority, created their own authoritarian structures. The cycle repeats because institutions, by their nature, seek self-preservation above their founding principles. The man who said, "My kingdom is not of this world," might be puzzled by St. Peter's Square's Egyptian obelisk, a pagan monument relocated by Pope Sixtus IX in 1586 at enormous expense. He might question why churches own television networks, theme parks, and shopping malls. He might wonder why pastors need bodyguards, why churches need ATMs in their lobbies, why sermon series are copyrighted and sold as products. Christianity started in Palestine under Roman occupation. Its founder was executed as a political criminal. His earliest followers were persecuted, martyred, and driven underground. Within 3 centuries, it became the empire's official religion. Within a millennium, it commanded armies and crowned kings. Within 2 millennia, it had fractured into 45,000 denominations, each claiming exclusive truth, many wielding enormous wealth and political influence while preaching humility and service. The carpenter from Nazareth ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. He touched lepers. He defended an adulteress from stoning. He chose fishermen, tax collectors, and zealots as his inner circle. He died between two thieves, promising one of them paradise. The institutions claiming to follow him have spent 2,000 years building walls, hierarchies, and dogmas that would have excluded him from their own gatherings. A homeless, unmarried Jewish rabbi who challenged religious authority and disrupted economic systems wouldn't be welcome in most churches that bear his name. If he returned today, he wouldn't find himself in the Vatican's marble halls or the crystal cathedrals of television evangelists. He'd more likely be with the homeless under highway overpasses, with refugees at border crossings, with the incarcerated and addicted, with those the institutional church has failed, forgotten, or actively harmed. He might once again fashion a whip of cords, not for the Temple of Jerusalem, but for the institutions that have monetized his message and weaponized his words. The greatest irony? The very book these institutions claim as their foundation contains warning after warning about exactly what they've become. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. The message was never complicated. Love your neighbor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the imprisoned, forgive your enemies, share what you have, serve rather than be served. The first will be last. The meek will inherit the earth. It's harder for a rich man to enter heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. 2,000 years later, the simple message has been buried under centuries of accumulated power, wealth, and theological complexity. The carpenter's revolution became an institution. The movement became a monument. The living faith became a dead religion. And somewhere, perhaps, that carpenter's son is still overturning tables, still calling out hypocrisy, still choosing the rejected over the respectable, still insisting that love trumps law, that mercy beats judgment, that the kingdom of heaven belongs not to the powerful, but to the poor in spirit. The question isn't whether Jesus would recognize today's church. The question is whether today's church would recognize Jesus. Based on 2,000 years of evidence, the answer seems clear. They'd probably crucify him again. This time not with nails and wood, but with scandal and litigation, with denominational excommunication and social media campaigns. The religious establishment has always been threatened by genuine prophets. That, at least, hasn't changed. If you made it this far, you've just witnessed one of history's most profound contradictions: how a message of radical love and poverty became an empire of power and wealth. Drop a comment telling me what surprised you most. And remember, question everything, especially those who claim to have all the answers. This is Professor Archive, reminding you that real history is always more complex than the stories institutions tell about themselves. Until next time, keep digging deeper.